So let's talk through the Spiky Knights of the Dread households, with an overview of some of the pros and cons for every Chaos Knight in 10th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Knights, and in this video I thought we could talk through each and every unit in the faction and some of the pros and cons of including them in competitive lists. Let's go through the units of the core index first and then move on to their Forge World Imperial Armour style Knights. First up, let's start with the little ones and talk through their various flavours of War Dogs. These are all battle line non-Titanic vehicle units, and do seem to have been rather ubiquitous in making up the majority of competitive Chaos Knight lists ever since they came about as their own faction, putting lots and lots of fast and threatening vehicles on the board. War Dogs are fast moving with good objective control, so it can be quite nice to have on the outskirts of the army fighting over the midfield objectives and forcing the opponent to trade units. They're still fairly tough per point, with their iron shields giving them a 5+ invulnerable save against ranged attacks and the ability to diabolic bulwark if needed. Their speed means that they can often push dread auras up the board fairly fast to give the opponent more chance to fail when they're fighting units on the central objectives, and compared with big knights they're a bit more efficient for things like objectives, actions and screening, where you just have to dedicate less points to doing that, I suppose a little bit less than before, given that the Titanic Knights can still shoot, but stopping them charging is still quite a big deal. For some stratagems they're a bit less efficient than the big knights, such as Diabolic Bulwark, which still just affects one of them, but several stratagems can affect multiple War Dogs, things like the Dread Hounds one, for focusing fire with a bunch of sustained hits, Knights of Shade to allow you to walk through walls with multiple War Dogs at once, maybe a long leash if you have a useful big knight on the board and you spread out a bit, and in general they're a little bit more expendable than the big knights, so maybe aren't the worst thing to have on the front line. I still say that as they're big threatening vehicles, they're still not that cheap for an outlying unit. Knights don't really have anything that's truly expendable. But outside of allied demons, War Dogs are as close as it gets. For this one, the Dog Stalker is the flexible loadout one, with the option of Chain Talon versus Slaughter Claw, depending on whether or not you want a sweep mode or heavy hitting anti-tank, and Chain Cannon versus the Demon Breath Spear, usually with a Havoc launcher on top for a little bit of indirect fire. Overall, I feel like they're quite efficient between those. Both the Chain Cannon and the Demon Breath Spear are quite good weapon profiles, and it might just genuinely depend on whether or not you want more anti-armor or more anti-infantry in your list. I tend to see more people going for the Slaughter Claw over the Chain Talon, though I'd say the Chain Talon isn't unusable. And otherwise, for supporting rules, the Dog Stalker gets the character keyword if you want a full War Dog army, and you could use Epic Challenge with them. And they also get a fairly nice damage buff rule with +1 to wounds against enemy units that are greater than 6 inches away from any of their fellows. I'd say perhaps their biggest issue is they've got competition with the specialist War Dogs like the Brigands and the Carnivores, which tend to make up the majority of choices, though I still think they're a really strong unit. I've chosen to rate them a big 9 out of 10 here. If you do want to run full War Dog spam, then one's kind of necessary, so you might often see at least one in a list. While we're on the subject of Chaos Knights, I thought I'd just mention the channel giveaway for August, and this one's going to be for 3 winners to get a custom Knight household of their choice. Basically any 3 plastic knights made by Games Workshop, any combination of Imperial or Chaos, including things like the Cerastus Lancers or the Tyrant Knight if you want. Any one big knight can be swapped out for 4 Armigers or War Dogs if you'd like, if you want a bit more of a skew to the Hounds. And hopefully that should be a good way for a few people to start a new army with around about 1500 points worth of models. As per normal for the channel giveaways, there's 2 equal ways to enter, both of them links down in the video description. Either you can support the channel on Patreon for any amount. It is the main thing that allows me to keep on making videos like this each and every day. Channel patrons get automatically entered into the giveaways each month, or alternatively you can enter the draw via Facebook and support the channel via social media. To do that you do 3 actions: subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the Facebook page, and then once you've done those 2 to actually enter the draw, a giveaway post appears on the 1st of August. If you respond to that post with a photo of any 40k mini or imagery, along with your name and the date handwritten within the same photo, the last bit just to stop Facebook bots and spammers and make sure prizes go to real people. Then when that's done, the draw is done with a random number generator and announced on the channel update video on YouTube around about the 4th of August. And following that, I'll get in touch with the winners to ask which knights they'd like and to get them ordered in from Games Workshop. Feel free to check out the links in the video description if you're interested in entering for that one, either the Facebook page or the Patreon. In any case, let's continue with a look through War Dogs, and the next one is the War Dog Brigands. Again, a battle line vehicle unit, but this one not a character, 170 points, and has a lot of the same advantages. You swap out the melee weapon for the other weapon, so you both get a Demon Breath Spear, a Reaper Chain Cannon, and usually a Havoc Launcher, all hitting on a 2+, so incredibly accurate on the fast-moving gun turret that is the Brigand. And you also get extra AP if you target the closest viable target. Really quite nice to bump that chain cannon up to AP2 and be more of a threat to armoured things. They're certainly efficient enough just to be good firepower all by themselves, and lots of Chaos Knight lists use absolutely loads of these things. They could pair well with things like the Desecrator rerolling ones to hit if you wanted, or using the Dreadhound stratagem to focus fire with a bunch of sustained hits. Both of those can amp up their firepower just a little bit more. For downsides, they are the single most expensive War Dog, which isn't particularly great given that they don't gain any toughness per point, and they are a little bit short-ranged at 24 inches, which might mean that they could struggle to reach out and hit things at the back of the enemy army. Though they do have a good enough movement characteristic to get things in range when they need to, they might just need to push up a bit. In any case, they're certainly one of the strongest Chaos Knight units right now. It's very common to see competitive lists running somewhere between 4 and 6 of these things, and for that reason I've chosen to give them a 10 out of 10. Next up, and trying to rival them for a bit of ranged firepower, is the War Dog Executioner. This one's the other shooty War Dog from the core index, built with the Armiger Helverin type kit, 140 points, and instead of the spear and the chain cannon, this one gets you mass strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3 shooting with their auto cannons. They're quite a lot longer range than the Brigands, so could be alright to maybe sit on a home field objective if you want it. And the profile maybe isn't excellent against everything, but does come into its own against the right targets, particularly things like mid-toughness things with lowish saves. Maybe things like Drukhari Skimmers could be a good example, or some of the sort of medium toughness demons perhaps. Being the joint cheapest War Dog is definitely a positive as well. It means that they've got better defense further point than most. For the downsides for these guys, I'd say the main things are low AP on the primary gun, which means that with cover, a lot of things could be saving on very good saves against them, which does mean that they're not quite as general purpose as the Brigands. Not getting a Havoc Launcher isn't amazing, and they don't get the inbuilt rerolls or the anti-fly special rule like the Loyalists get, which makes them quite good against Catan. Instead, they have a +1 to hit below half strength units, which will occasionally come up, but the majority of the targets they tend to fire at won't trigger that. You could also use things like cheaper demon units if you really wanted to have just something to sit on a home objective if you want. Overall, they definitely have a lot of flaws compared with some of the other War Dogs out there. I feel like realistically very few people are going to take them when you have the option of the Brigand, even with the 30 points difference. I still say they're usable enough for a cheap bit of volume fire though, if they happen to fit in a list okay. I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10 overall. Next up, perhaps to try and rival the Stalker, there's the War Dog Huntsman. This is essentially the Armiger Warglaive but painted in Chaos colours, armed with a Demon Breath Spear and Reaper Chain Talon plus a Stubber or Melter Gun on top. They're the same price as the War Dog Stalker and basically are pretty much that but with a locked loadout, and also they swap out the special rule for re-rolling wound rolls and damage results of 1 against monsters and vehicles, which certainly makes the things like the Melter Gun and the Demon Breath Spear a fair bit more dangerous. Overall, I feel like they're kind of similar to the Stalker in most ways, perhaps a bit of a maybe choice if you wanted this exact loadout and you preferred the special rule and you didn't want the Havoc Launcher. I feel like if the Stalker didn't exist, they'd see a bit more play, but at the exact same cost, I feel like most people would go for the Stalker, perhaps just out of preference for wanting a Slaughter Claw and a Havoc Launcher, which I both think are quite nice. Realistically though, I don't think it's that far behind. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10. Finally, for the core index War Dogs, we've got the brutal melee machine that is the War Dog Carnivore, 140 points, and very fast moving with a big 14-inch move and the ability to re-roll charges. They're perhaps a particularly good choice for Knights of Shade to allow them to ghost through walls, potentially 2 of them at a time, and that means that there's very rarely things that are going to be able to hide from them too well. As they naturally want to get close, they're good for pushing out dread range onto objectives and things, hopefully having a few more units fail Battle Shock and struggle to claim points. And if they do manage to make it into combat with something meaningful, their damage in melee is absolutely huge. 6 attacks with a Slaughter Claw, strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 plus 2, or you can swap it out for a brutal 12 attack sweep profile. They still get a Havoc Launcher, so can also chip into a bit of indirect fire. In a War Dog heavy army, you do have quite a lot of indirects to stack on a lighter infantry unit and try and wipe it out, and being the joint cheapest knight at 140 points makes them pretty excellent for the front line. I did feel it was kind of weird that these guys went all the way down to 140. Ever since that was the case, they've basically been seen as one of the very best and often been spammed in tournament lists. I guess their biggest weakness is screening, but given good movement and Knights of Shades, it's not even all that easy to do that. They don't really just want to be fighting chaff, but I guess it's not the worst thing in the world given that they're the cheapest Chaos Knight and they're quite sacrificial. I've chosen to rank them a 10 out of 10 overall, and as mentioned, it's not uncommon to see Chaos Knight competitive lists basically consisting of nothing but carnivores, brigands, one stalker, and some allied demons. They're strong enough to carry the melee part of an army and do really well. Next up, we're on to the Titanic Knights, starting with the Abhorrent Class. The Abhorrent Class gets Toughness 12, a big 22 wounds, and got some improvements in the last balanced data slate, being able to walk straight through big bits of terrain now, which has definitely kept them a lot more mobile on the table than they used to be. They tend to have pretty scary melee as well, with either an enormous chainsword or the claw. For weaknesses, they don't tend to be really all that durable per cost, particularly not in close combat where they don't have an ion shield or the way to use the diabolic bulwark for it. Most of them cost in the region of 400 points or a bit more and need to be played with a bit more carefully, often screened by war dogs until they can get into something important. For the Desecrator itself, it gets the massive anti-tank laser destructor, 3 attacks at strength 18, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 3, all of that hitting on a slightly unusually good 2+, and gets devastating wounds if it attacks monsters and vehicles. If there's enemy tanks or armour on the other side of the board, this is the right weapon to point at them. I feel like its Wardog buffing ability is one of the better ones as well. Reroll ones to hit for Wardogs within 9 inches of it. This one's really quite nice for Brigands in particular. It means they can all be hitting on a 2+ rerolling ones, and he might even be able to justify a long leash from time to time if he had 3 of them outside of his aura perhaps. On top of that, he gets the standard Abhorrent melee. You can either have the damage 8 Warp Strike Claw or the more space-running killing sweep attack of the Reaper Chainsword. For weaknesses for the Desecrator, it's perhaps the biggest thing is that it's just not super general purpose. It's basically got one big gun that will do tanks, but not really all that much else. It just feels a little bit wasted against elite infantry or even super light vehicles. Still definitely not bad though. If paired with a bunch of things to thin out enemy hordes, I feel like it could work okay, particularly as it works kind of well with war dogs compared with some. They don't tend to appear in all that many competitive lists, but I feel like he's fairly strong casually. I've chosen to rate him a 7 out of 10. Next up, we've got the pretty cheap Knight Rampager. He's the melee specialist knight, the Dark Mirror of the Imperial Gallant, and he's just 380 points. Really quite cheap for a Titanic vehicle, even if it is one that's basically locked to melee only. He moves 12 inches and will very much like the new walk through walls type ability. It's going to be a lot harder to screen than he was before because of that, and he also gets a once per game advance and charge as well, which is kind of enormous. It means his average threat range on normal dice will be around about 22 or 23 inches on that turn, and if terrain isn't getting in the way, then that's going to get him into combat with basically what he wants. When he gets there, he can mete out some pretty enormous damage, 6 attacks at weapon skill 2+ with either the claw or chainsword profile. Having both an anti-Terminator and anti-Marine sort of profile I think is really quite a nice advantage for him. He also gets sustained hits 1 on the charge, so it is even scarier there. And as a character can epic challenge if he just wants to absolutely wail on an enemy commander hidden in a big squad. Beyond that, he's got an aura of reroll ones to hit in melee, which could help out nearby carnivores a bit, and maybe could enjoy the panoply of the Cursed Knights for worsening enemy AP if he did just want to make him a big tough threat that the opponent's going to struggle to take down. That would add a lot of points though, and he might be considering whether or not it might be worth going for a Lancer if he went for that, I suspect. For weaknesses, as a dedicated melee knight, he is still vulnerable to screening, even if he does interact with terrain a bit better. He doesn't really want to be just charging out, destroying a light infantry unit, and then the enemy hitting him hard with a huge counter attack in return. Being an abhorrent is also not super tough in melee in particular, at least not for the points that you spend on him. So while he will absorb quite a bit of fire, there is a bit more chance than some that he's going to make a big splash and then get counter-attacked and destroyed. Perhaps the biggest question for him is whether or not he's worth his points in, say, around about 2 or 3 Wardog carnivores to fill a similar sort of role. It does seem that a lot of lists seem to think that the carnivores will do them better. Overall, I'd say he's not massively stand out, but he's not completely weak either. I feel like the walk through walls thing, without having to spend CP on it, really helped him out. And his advance and charge once per game definitely makes him a lot more of a threat. I've chosen to score him a 7 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the spooky scary Psycho Knight that is the Knight Abominant. This one's 385 points. Good that Games Workshop finally gave him some meaningful points decreases, though I still feel like he's probably going to be a slightly niche choice compared with some. I feel like he does lack a bit of a threat of some of the stronger knights. For his positives, he gets a single battle shock test that he can hand out against an enemy unit, and in Chaos Knights that can be kind of big. A few stratagems and the detachment rule from round 3 onwards get way better if you can have an enemy fail a test, and this is one of the few ones to stack extra tests on things, and that does add maybe quite a bit of value to him. Otherwise, between his Bale Mace and his Electro Scourge, he does have some fairly good anti-elite melee, lots of damage 3 attacks from the Electro Scourge with sustained hits. He will be quite good at killing things like Terminators, and also he's kind of favoured to be moving up the board and getting stuck in. An aura of mortal wounds around him can do a bit of chip damage, though it is a little bit scattergun. For downsides though, I'd say both his melee and his range just aren't really super general purpose. The Electro Scourge is pretty nice against enemy elites. The things with 2+ saves and Armour of Contempt could have it hitting surprisingly lackluster, and if he's hitting anything that is wounding on a 5+, you're probably not going to get that much damage. For his big Volkite gun, it is a bit hit and miss as well. He does get a bunch of strength 12 and damage 3 attacks, though it's AP 0, so it's really relying on devastating wounds on 6s to punch through a bit of damage, and that could be very swingy. You might roll 3 6s and do amazing, or you might roll none and then just have all your attacks bounce off some good armor saves. I feel like not being super general purpose isn't really the best thing for a huge almost 400 point model, as it might often not really have the best choice of what it needs to destroy. It just needs to try and take down the thing that's put in front of it, whatever it is. For another minor disadvantage, having the Psyker keyword means that some attacks are just kind of extra good against it. Anti-Psyker weapons will find it a little bit weirdly easy to take down compared with some. Having said all that though, it is fairly cheap and the Battle Shock thing is quite nice. I feel like it's a lot better at 385 points than what it started 10th edition on, though I still feel like for big knights, most people are probably going to look elsewhere. I've chosen to score him a 6 out of 10 for this one. I feel like it's not unusable for the whole package, though I suspect it's going to be a bit rarer than some to include in competitive lists. Next up, we've got the Knight Despoiler for 430 points. This one's basically the Chaos version of the Flexible Questoris, with the option for all the arm weapons in any combination, including interesting double gun loadouts that the Loyalists can't get. You could have an interesting sort of Gatling cannon knight if you wanted, 36 shots worth of Avenger Gatling cannons to just utterly ruin any enemy elites out there. If you did want to go big investments, then getting the extra ability of +1 to wound all the way from turn 1 if the enemy's Battle Shock could genuinely be kind of interesting in that. If you do get Battle Shock on the right enemy at the right time, then that sort of volume fire with +1 to wound is pretty fearsome. Both the other weapons are pretty good though. The Battle Cannon puts out a ton of volume fire even if it is low AP, and the Melter Gun is genuinely fearsome against enemy tanks and monsters that does kind of want to be within 12-inch range. Otherwise, for unit abilities, it gets a single hit and wound reroll, which I think is okay. It's kind of only really super impactful on the thermal cannon though. I feel like all the rest of the shots you don't really care too much if you're just rerolling one of them. And it gets a Ruin Storm rocket pod mounted on the top of it for a little bit more crack missile goodness, which definitely doesn't hurt. For downsides, it is the most expensive of the Codex pattern Abhorrent classes. I think that the leadership buffs for War Dogs is a pretty weak aura buff that just isn't always going to come up. And all of the guns that it has does have some issues. None of them are truly general purpose really. They either have low strength, low AP, or low effective range, one of the three. Again, I feel like it's maybe in the region where it's just kind of fine and not a complete liability in casual play, but rarely going to make it into competitive lists when competing with the scary War Dogs out there. I've chosen to rate him a 7 out of 10. Lastly, for the core index knights, we've got the Knight Tyrant. This one's the Loyalist Dominus but painted in Chaos colours, and it's 510 points for a great big walking fortress of guns. It's a bit tougher than the rest of the knights with a 2+ save with toughness 13, so las cannons wound it on a 5+ and also gets 24 wounds as well. This one in particular seems like a good choice for that panoply of the Cursed Knight. Worsening AP is kind of huge on a 2+ save, particularly when you can easily get cover for it as well. There's a good chance that you won't need to use Diabolic Bulwark on it. And then it has some fairly scary and general purpose firepower. The Volcano Lance, which is always going to make enemy tanks or vehicles nervous. A good roll from that could just insta-kill them. A big plasma weapon to put the hurt on enemy marines and terminators, plus some melter guns, siege breakers and missiles. Beyond that, he grants War Dogs cover nearby, though it is kind of easy to get that in 10th edition for the most part anyway. And his special rule, I think, is an interesting one, maybe a little bit peripheral when you're paying 510 points for the model, but he does deny deep strike at 12 inches, and that means that the opponent can't use any drop close shenanigans to sneak away on objectives. For downsides though, I think he does come with a fair few. The Volcano Lance just isn't anywhere near as savage as the Loyalists with their inbuilt rerolls that they get for it. Lay low the Tyrants does mean that that'll be hitting far harder for them than this. He is really quite slow with an 8-inch move, which might mean that he struggles to get line of sight on things. The Flamer Harpoon loadout particularly suffers from that one, and I feel like it's by far the weaker of the two. It's got short range, so it might not be able to catch the things that it wants, and also means getting up super close, and this thing just really doesn't want to be in close combat if it can avoid it. Not having much melee and no option to fall back and shoot means that it really doesn't want to be charged and locked up, otherwise it's going to lower its mobility options and you might not be able to get onto objectives or draw lines of sight that you need to. It'll just literally have to stand and be a gun turret in close combat unless it either falls back or something comes to bail it out. The Volcano Lance and Big Plasma being blast weapons certainly don't help with that, so it needs a bit of good screening. Overall, I feel like for the massive points investment, it's not really quite as big a yield as some of the other Chaos Knights, even if it is individually really quite a big and scary unit. I've chosen to rank him a 6 out of 10 here. Next up, let's move on to the Index Imperial Armour Knights, starting with the Dog Moirax. This one's 160 points, so it is a little cheaper than the Brigands. It's quite a flexible loadout with 4 different ranged weapons, depending on the exact target that you want to take down, and the option of basically a Slaughter Claw with a built-in anti-infantry flamer, which I guess is a nice enough advantage. I feel like the main issue for the Moirax is its points cost and its competition. If you want a dedicated shooting war dog, I feel like you're going to just be a lot better off with either the more expensive Brigands, with both of its gun profiles arguably being better than anything that the Moirax has to offer, never mind hitting on 2s and packing a Havoc launcher as well, or the slightly cheaper War Dog Carnivore with the similar sort of mixed role variant. It basically feels like it does the same job as the mixed role Moirax but cheaper. I feel like the flexible weapons are all interesting enough if you want to be able just to have a bit more power against the specific target that they're good against. They can help out with taking down a few specific things that maybe feel a bit less general purpose than some. I'm not sure that the Free Heroic Intervention is a particularly solid special rule as well. It's not awful when it comes up, but it does depend on having the melee loadout in the first place. It's not like the other knights can't access it in a pinch if you can spare 1 CP. Overall just feels a bit weaker versus the other war dogs out there. I've chosen to rank it a 6 out of 10. Next up we've got the Index Imperial Armour Abhorrent Class. First up the Chaos Questor Megara, which is 435 points, making it the single priciest of the Abhorrents. This one gets a spammed lightning cannon with a bunch of strength 9 AP 0 damage 2 hits, a 5+ invulnerable save that works in melee, which I guess is handy enough on the front lines, ignoring modifiers for war dogs, which is helpful against some armies but not really against the general field I'd say, and healing D3 wounds per turn for a bit of regeneration, which could make it a little bit harder to bring down. I feel like for paying more points than the rest of the Chaos Abhorrents though, it's really let down by that main gun. The lightning cannon being only strength 9 and AP 0 just means that it's not very good against the majority of targets, and I really don't think that at that points cost the other special rules that it has are enough to sell it. I'm not entirely sure why this one's pricier than the Loyalist version for some reason as well. Doesn't really seem like it's gaining that much. Overall, I've chosen to score it a 4 out of 10. I feel like you'd be better off with the Abhorrents in the core index than this. Otherwise, for the Chaos Questor Styrex, this one is 430 points, and is a variant of the Megara with a few different rules. Again, it's kind of let down by its main gun in the Big Volkite, which is very similar to the Abominant, but it costs far more than an Abominant. So I guess in terms of trying to sell it versus that, it'd be looking at the other special rules. The 5+ invulnerable save that works in melee is alright. It does have quite a fun ability to slow down enemies by -2 to move, advance and charge. And again, the grants war dogs ignore modifiers type thing. Overall, I feel like with that slowing down unit special rule, it's probably got a little bit more worth to it than the Megara, plus the ability to actually have some devastating wounds on its main gun. Though I still think that it's a bit of a tough sell, not really having that much range threat on a big primary knight like this. Next up we've got the Chaos Cerastus Knights, the Cerastus chassis being kind of similar to the Abhorrent one, but they get an extra 2-inch movement and an extra 3 wounds worth of durability. Both of those kind of useful upgrades for getting around the board and having a little bit more staying power. The Atropos specifically gets its 5+ invulnerable save in melee once more, which again is quite a useful upgrade, and then gets 2 solid guns between the Las Cutter and the Graviton Singularity Generator, plus some okayish melee that isn't quite as strong as some of the other knights, but does anti-elites quite well. It gets a +1 to hit against monsters and vehicles, and helps war dogs out versus Titanic units. Overall, between the invulnerable save and melee, 2 fairly good gun profiles, and the stat line increases, I think it's a pretty reasonable big knight. I've chosen to score it a 7 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Chaos Cerastus Acheron, the big flamethrower one. Again, 420 points, but doing a lot less than the Atropos, I think. It gets the same chassis, but a bit more melee with a Reaper Chainsword equivalent style attack. And then its big gun is a 2d6 Strength 8, AP 1 and Damage 2 flamer that will strip cover with its ability, plus a Battle Shock aura for war dogs that applies in the fight phase. Overall, this one feels like one of the weakest knights out there. Really weak damage on the primary gun for a big weapon of a main knight. And also I think stripping cover is nice and everything, but just not quite enough to justify an entire Titanic knight as its primary rule. Extra Battle Shock test could be helpful enough later in the game, but it's kind of clunky, needing to both be near war dogs and also for them to be in combat, and then the enemy having to fail at that point. Though occasionally it could allow you some easier stratagems and a bit of better damage. And like the Tyrant with its big flamethrower, I feel like it was a real loser when Overwatch went away from big Titanic vehicles like this. I feel like it was perhaps one of the only major selling points for the night before. Overall, between all that, I suspect you're better off with something a bit more dangerous. I've chosen to rate him a 3 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Chaos Castigator for 445 points. Again, they move quickly with the boosted stat line, and the Castigator's main armament is a twin bolt cannon, essentially 2 Gatling cannons taped together for reroll wounds, and that does make it into a far more general purpose weapon, a bit more able to punch up against things and get some fairly standard knightly melee to back it up. As they go, I think its aura ability is alright, a nice sustained hits 1 aura range that can be nice for War Dog Brigands, so good to have just a little bit of synergy there. The big Gatling cannon suppresses the enemy for a -1 to hit for them, so if you don't wipe out your targets, then they're not going to be fighting quite as effectively next turn. And could be another one that could do quite well with the early dread sort of enhancement for a +1 to wound against battle shocked things. That'll mean that bolt cannon could be wounding even things like enemy knights more times than not. Obviously kind of dependent on getting the battle shock off though. For weaknesses, the main thing is that its range will still struggle with toughness 7 or more things, even if the wound rerolls help, and for the Chaos Knights it is the single priciest out of any of the Abhorrent and Cerastus style patterns, even if I think it does get quite a good gun for the investment. Overall, again, I'd rate this one as usable enough, decent enough melee, range, and an aura ability and a special rule. I've chosen to rate him a 7 out of 10. Finally for the Cerastus, we've got the Lancer, 420 points, so really quite a nice, cheap, and very fast and dangerous knight. The Lancers are extra fast with a 14-inch move, which is pretty great in combination with no longer even needing to pay CP to walk through walls. Again, it's a knight you're going to really struggle to be able to keep away from. The Lancer doesn't have much range damage, just a little bit of firepower with that shock lance to thin out some infantry potentially, but it does hit in melee spectacularly hard with the sort of warp strike claw kind of profile, and also gets free tank shock on the way in, usually averaging around about 4 mortal wounds on the enemy with that, and could epic challenge out an enemy hero if they wanted to. That big shield gives it a 4+ invulnerable save both at range and in melee, which is pretty excellent, not needing to use the Diabolic Bulwark, and is really good compared with the relative fragility of things like the Abhorrence to being countercharged. Either the opponent is going to need to do a lot more work to bring this down in the counter attack, or they might fail. Otherwise, its aura ability gives you the assault keywords to range weapons, which I guess might help with things like brigands pushing up to the midfield, or maybe a War Dog Stalker that needs to advance to an objective and still wants to open fire. I feel like in general you're probably going to outpace them kind of quickly though, or they're not going to want to advance, so they might be able to charge. Though I do think it's kind of a shame that you can't use a long leash on this one, due to that one keying off the Abhorrent keyword, which the Cerastus don't have. Again, like the Rampager, I guess one of the other big weaknesses is being screened from prime targets. That's always going to be a downside with a more strictly melee knight. Overall, I feel like the Knight Lancer is one of the strongest big knights for Chaos Knights at the moment. It seems to be one of the most played of the Titanic Knights in competitive lists when they are taken. I feel like it's still really quite an interesting option. I've chosen to rate him an 8 out of 10 here. Lastly, for the knight chassis, we've got the Acastus class knights, the enormous knights that tower over even the regular ones. 700 points for the Acastus Porphyrion and 765 points for the Asterius. These are basically the knights that you want to have if you're fighting against enemy super heavies. Great big walking gun turrets that can take down enemy armour with ease. They're somewhat similar to the Knight Tyrants in a few ways, toughness 13 with a 2+ save, but these ones are with a big 30 wounds. Plenty of armies might just be put in the position where they need to try and kill everything else and just try and ignore these, but they do have quite a lot of downsides. They don't really want to be tagged in combat as they can't fall back and shoot. They're slow moving with the 8-inch move. They don't get built-in hit and wound rerolls like the Loyalists. They can't take enhancements as they aren't characters, and they're just very, very costly. I feel like you really run the risk that if your opponent doesn't have enormous, great, big, heavy targets for them just to delete wholesale, then you've definitely overinvested with these guys. I certainly feel like you'd overcommitted to the points of them if you're playing against a multiple small unit style list, hiding units and everything. What they do quite well though is have a good chance to one-round enemy Imperial or Chaos Knights. The Porphyrion gets its Magna las cannons, which are just utterly ruinous to anything from big heavy tanks to super heavies. They've not got a terrible chance to one-round enemy Questoris if they happen to be shooting well. Beyond that, they get some anti-fly missiles and some lethal hits if they're static. If anything, the Asterius takes it to the next level as well, being even more points at 765, but those big conversion beam cannons getting even more damage. They do need to be at a slightly specific range and not too close to it, otherwise the firepower drops off a bit, so it's generally going to be standing at the back of the board, and this one also gets a little bit of indirect fire against infantry, though it feels a little bit token on a 765 point unit. Overall, I feel like for more general take-all-comers lists, these guys are going to be overkill and just take up too many points in an already low model army. I guess if you're knowing that you're playing a big fun game though, and there's going to be loads of heavy hitting things on both sides, then they could be more worth it. For more optimised lists though, I've given the Porphyrion a 4 out of 10 and the Asterius a 3 out of 10, just due to further overcommitting to the same theme. In any case though, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know what you're making of Chaos Knights in 10th edition. I'm perhaps a bit surprised that Games Workshop haven't managed to do a bit more to genuinely make big knights viable, given how many balance passes there have been. I feel like they have made a bunch of steps in the right direction over the edition, but just seemingly not enough to tip the balance yet. I still feel like at more casual levels of play though, most of the other knights are at least fairly usable. Certainly nice that they got a bunch of points decreases of one sort or another though. In any case, let me know what you think. Feel free to check out the links down in the video description if you did want to enter for this Knight Household giveaway in early August. The links to the Patreon and the Facebook page are down in the video description. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.